first one from 1989 is called The Burbs, and it is directed by Joe Dante. And I'll start by saying a little bit about Joe Dante. I love this guy to death. He has made so many movies that I have enjoyed so much over the years and watched again and again. And I'll just mention some of them. I'll say that Joe Dante, like so many famous people, James Cameron, Jack Nicholson, and Ron Howard, the list goes on and on and on. It came out of the Roger Corman School of Filmmaking, which are cheap movies made quickly. There's an old joke about Roger Corman. I'm sure I'm getting it wrong, but that Roger Corman could film a movie about the Second World War, with for $1,000 with a bush. That was the only thing that he needed. And Dante learned a lot from Roger Corman about all aspects of movie making. If you look at the list of his films, the first film I suppose that anyone saw was Piranha, which was a modern-day monster movie. And he followed that that was in 1978. In 1981, The Howling, which is a modern-day werewolf movie, which has amazing special effects. And both of these movies are very funny. Dante co-wrote Rock and Roll High School, the movie about the Ramones, which is, again, a movie which I love to death. He did the segment in the Twilight Zone movie that everyone loves the best. And he had a big hit in 1984 with Gremlins. That was the high point of his career commercially. He made Explorers in 1985. And he made Inner Space in 1987, which is sort of a take on Fantastic Voyage. It's got Martin Short and Dennis Quaid in it. It's very funny. He made a movie in 1990. He made a sequel to Gremlins called The New Batch in 1990, which is perhaps the strangest, wildest film big-budget film that has ever come out of Hollywood. It's just completely nuts. And you see there undiluted Dante's great influences, which include the cartoonists Chuck Jones and Tex Avery and Frank Tashlin. And Tashlin went on to be a joke writer and a movie director himself. I would recommend that people track down his movie, Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, which is tremendously prescient about social media, even though it was made 60 years ago. And I kind of debated as to, I have this rule for the list, that one film per director. The reason for that is that without that, I'd have about 7 or 8 films by Stanley Kubrick in the list, and we couldn't have that. I'll just say something briefly about Gremlins 2, that you have this absurd situation of a sentient monster voiced by the great Tony Randall, who seems to hold the fate of New York City in his hands. And he's being interviewed in the movie by someone dressed as Dracula, one of those late-night monster movie hosts. And he's called the Brain Gremlin. And he explains that he wants civilization. And the interviewer, Grandpa Fred, says, "Yes, but what sort of civilization are you speaking of?" And he says in a voice rather like this, "The niceties, Fred, the fine points, diplomacy, compassion, standards, manners, tradition. That's what we're reaching toward. Oh, we may stumble along the way, but civilization, yes. The Geneva Convention, chamber music, Susan Sontag." I can't help but laugh at that Susan Sontag. That's just completely absurd. But The Burbs is a movie starring Tom Hanks about a man who is taking a week off work and intends to do nothing but stay at home. And he gets drawn into this conspiratorial thinking about his new neighbors, the Klopeks, who are these weirdos who have moved in next door No one goes in, no one goes out. There are no deliveries. And his neighbors, played by Rick Dukeman, a talented comic actor who died a couple of months ago, and the great Bruce Dern, draw him into this idea that the Klopeks are this monstrous family who are doing monstrous things in their basement. And the movie is an examination of suburbia. And this question of whether suburbia is the kind of place that leads, because it's such an artificial way of living, that it draws people into madness. And this is a tension throughout the movie. This idea is suburbia, solid neighborhoods, where people stick together, or is it a place where, like the old timer in the town of Hinkley Hills that Rick Dukeman talks about, who has pulled one too many cherry phosphates at the drugstore and one day snaps, murders his family, and buries them. This movie is above all enormously funny, and it is also one of the most quotable movies that you're ever going to see. I don't want to spoil it for you. I'll just mention a couple of them. Bruce Dern meets or sees one of these young people, one of the Klopeks, the young Klopek. There's two of them. There's two adults and a boy. And he asks the boy what his name is. And to call this boy retiring would be quite an understatement. And he says, Hans. And Bruce Dern says, Hans, fine Christian name. Hans Christian Andersen. So what are you, Catholic? Now, I suppose that's a joke that younger people won't get. I mean, the point of the joke is that real Americans are Protestant. The Catholics, they seem to be, fairly normal people, but, they're not really top drawer. And there's another quotable bit from it that the character played by Rick Dukeman gets Ray Peterson, who is Tom Hanks' character, to look at a book on demonology. And Ray becomes increasingly disconcerted with this, and he does the childish business of putting his hands over his ears and says, I'm not going to listen to this. I'm not going to hear this now. And this terribly excites Art, who says, Ray, you're chanting, unconscious chanting. That's one of the signs. And Art imitates him, chanting himself. I want to kill everyone. Satan is good. Satan is our pal. And then he says, hey, once they get in here, and he points at Ray's head, it's all over, pal. What you see in this movie is it's a very smart movie, although many of the people in the movie appear to be, not that bright or confused. And I think this is one of the problems that Dante has had, is that there's a piece on him at the AV Club talking about how he could be considered one of these American auteurs who came up in the 1970s. But it says that Dante is not going to be confused. Yeah, it says the charge was never leveled at Joe Dante because Dante never put on those kinds of airs. His entire career has been a celebration of American cheese. I really don't think that that's fair. That this idea that, you have two kinds of movies, smart movies and dumb movies, highbrow movies and lowbrow movies. I think that this the fellow at the AV Club who wrote this piece about Dante was missing the point, because Dante's movies are very smart indeed, and they're exceedingly elusive movies, and they allude largely to a common culture which has been lost in America and the Western world. And this culture derives to a large extent from television. That Dante was born, I believe, in 1949, and so he would have been part of the first generation to be largely raised by television. And it's important to remember when you're considering this that when we look at our fractured culture now, that it didn't used to be like this. That the generation that was raised in culture was exposed to the entire world through television. That you had the original programs that were made for television, the game shows, talk shows, sitcoms, dramas. But since the beginning of television, there's been this need to repurpose other forms of entertainment, movies, for instance. And you have people, no less than Martin Scorsese, who has said in several documentaries and in many interviews how so much of what he learned about the movies came from television. The television was a very broad education in that, as I say, everything in the world was there. And if you grew up watching, say, just Warner Brothers cartoons, as I did, you would learn about all sorts of things. You would learn about vaudeville. You would learn about all of these showbiz traditions, or tropes, as they call them now. You would learn all about the social and political world of the United States from the 1930s and 1950s. And this unity of culture that we see expressed in Dante's movies has largely disappeared now. T.S. Eliot once said that it doesn't matter what we read so long as we read the same things. And he was pointing to the need for a common culture, for a unity. And we're all off on our own thing now. We have the ability to look for things that are only the things that we want. Whereas the TV generation grew up under circumstances under which they were forced to watch things that they wouldn't have chosen to watch if they'd had a choice. And this is good for people. I think that it's very good for people. I think that another one of the reasons why Dante is not, why this movie, The Burbs, which I consider the best of his movies, was not a hit. And there's certain things lacking in it for a modern audience. That there's no strong female characters, there's no ass-kicking babes, there's no minorities to speak of. There's really no attempt to push any kind of political agenda. And it occurred to me the other day, while I was thinking about this topic, that so many movies are being remade now that perhaps they could remake The Burbs. And then I thought, well, who would star in it? Well, Adam Sandler in the Tom Hanks role, and Melissa McCarthy in the Bruce Dern role, and Kevin James in the Rick Dukeman role. And I thought this, and I made myself very sad that this is the level that we've been reduced to. That I think that a Hollywood producer, seeing these cast members would think, yeah, this could work, We could do a better version than the first one. So this is why I like The Burbs. There are great performances from Tom Hanks in it, who was in a transitional period. He tended to play smart aleck characters in his early films before he moved on to the heroic roles. And he achieves a kind of heroism in this film. You have Rick Dukeman, who I mentioned, who was sadly underfeatured. He didn't have much of a career, really. He started out children's entertainer in Vancouver. The great Bruce Dern, who I suppose got his break from Alfred Hitchcock. He appeared in several episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. He played a minor but pivotal role in Marnie, and he played one of the lead roles in Hitchcock's last film, Family Plot. And this Hitchcock reference is quite appropriate because The Burbs is, of course, a kind of parody of Rear Window. There are a lot of movie allusions in this picture. There is a great little homage to Murnau's Nosferatu. There is a hilarious parody of the famous Sergio Leone close-up. And Jerry Goldsmith, who is, no pun intended, the gold standard of latter-day movie composers, has a little homage to his own theme from Patton in it. And also, one of the characters is Corey Feldman. And he plays a kind of slacker, an amiable fellow who loves his street. And this is the conclusion that the movie comes to, that community is good. And those people that would seek to wreck community are bad. And I just have to say, when you look at the wreck that Corey Feldman's life has become, it's pleasing to look back to 1989, and here he is doing a great job in a great movie. So, the Burbs, you can't get it in Blu-ray except from England. I suspect that a Blu-ray version of this will be coming out in America in the next year or two. But I mean, if I've impressed you by my praise of it, this is a movie that plays on television all the time, so you have plenty of opportunities to see it.